in the presidential elections of Indonesia, but indeed all elections that are occurring in that country, and probably indeed the world, but we will obviously talk about Indonesia specifically and the context that has occurred. A couple points of context before I get into my 2 points, which will be, as my introduction suggested, why we don't think that these cash bribes are actually in the interests of the people that are taking them, and secondly, why it is immoral for those people to take them. So set up. The first thing is obviously to state that the election that has occurred in Indonesia has already occurred, but we would obviously regret and denounce the fact that 4 people did take bribes in the election that has passed, and we don't think they should obviously take bribes in elections still to come. The other thing that we want to suggest is that we obviously think part of the premise of this motion is to assume in some respects that the bribes that they are taking are somewhat enforceable, so people can obviously follow them to the ballot box and make sure that they do the vote that they're suggesting. Obviously as well, it also stands to reason that parties would have very little incentive to do this if the payoff was so speculative and uncertain. So that suggests that there is actually, even if some voters can get away with taking the cash bribe and then just, casting their vote for anyone, I'd suggest the majority are enforceable and therefore have the effects that we say that they do. So my first point with that in mind is that why is this not in the self-interest of poor people in the first place? And look, obviously this is a bit of a tricky debate insofar as, it's not what poor people do immediately on instinct do at the time, because obviously they do take these bribes at the moment. Obviously being a debate about not them as an actor, but what they should do, we can kind of step outside of the confines of what the mindset of a poor person is and say, well, they shouldn't do this thing because we know based on all the information that we have at our disposal that it's actually not in their best interest, right? So, why do we think it's not in their best interest? The first thing is to say that I actually just think that the benefit that they're getting is reasonably marginal. Now, obviously, I concede that maybe getting a few dollars for someone who is poor might be, somewhat of a benefit in terms of you might be able to buy some food for your family, but it's not that significant, and that is structurally true for a couple of reasons. The first is that the political parties that we're talking about in Indonesia have some money, but they are not cashed up loaded. That's for the reason that Indonesia is not a very wealthy country. The second reason is because the population of Indonesia is fucking huge, and therefore you have to obviously aggregate that payment over a large number of people. That suggests that the money might be enough to sway your vote, but it's obviously not enough to make a meaningful difference in your life, probably in the short term, but of course indeed over the long term. And that's the thing, you get that payment once and then the benefit disappears. We think compare that to the longer term harm that you're doing yourself, it is just not worth it. So why do we think in the long term that this payment is likely to be harmful? We think it's likely to be harmful for a number of reasons. The first is that it is on balance more likely to lead to outcomes that elect more right-wing and less progressive governments, or at least have more seats accumulate in the parliament. The first premise here is to obviously establish the pretty intuitive conception that these parties are less likely to be in the interests of these voters for very obvious reasons. Often they talk about policies like tax cuts, which tend to benefit the higher echelons of society. In this particular context, we saw Joko Widodo's party, whilst obviously not being left-wing, was definitely more moderate and centrist than his opposition, which was like a former military guy that had a very hard right agenda and had conceptualized and talked about policies like, targeting infrastructure spending in high-income parts of society. So I think it's pretty clear then that those parties are worse for those people. Why do we think, on balance, these parties are more likely to both use bribes and have those bribes manifest in outcomes that are more favourable for them? I will concede here that all parties do use bribes, but there are some structural reasons why we think that more conservative right-wing parties are more likely to use them on balance. The first reason is that progressive parties probably don't need to rely on them in the same way, in that their policies already automatically, to some extent, appeal to those voters. The second reason is that more conservative parties are often parties that are kind of comprised of richer individuals in the first place, so they have both the means and motive to do bribes in the first place. And the third reason is because of the current context, the more right-wing party is in opposition. Often incumbency affords you certain benefits, like being able to target programs in certain areas. When you don't have that structural advantage as an opposition party, you have again greater means and incentive to resort to bribes. What that means is that in the long term, so looking sort of forward at future outcomes that we're likely to see in Indonesia, noting that the election has just passed, we think this is more likely to result in a swing towards more right-wing parties that will obviously be harmful for those voters. And note the context that this occurs in. The swing that would need to happen to get Widodo out of office and the opposition leader in is a margin of around 5%. And we think, most empirical evidence suggests that bribes have the capacity to swing elections around that number or potentially indeed more. So that's something that we should be concerned about. And the other thing is looking at the current context. Whilst obviously these bribes didn't happen and result in the right-wing guy being elected here, what it did do is result in the parliament, because the parliamentary elections occur at the same time as the presidential elections, what it did result in, we think, is a large number of those opposition seats being gained at the displacement of more left-wing and smaller opposition parties that could have occurred in that context. So at the end of all of this, it's pretty clear that that is a bad outcome. But the other reason why it's a bad outcome, my second reason, is just the very intuitive point that you now no longer have the same incentive to develop good policy that benefits poor people, because you have a very easy out, which is, well, simply bribe them. Why would you need to worry about developing good policy that appeals to those people if you can simply rely on that metric? But the last reason why it's bad for poor people and not in their interest is because it normalises bribery in the very first instance. Yes, again, we concede bribery is rampant in Indonesia. We will not stop it by virtue of poor people not taking these bribes, but them taking these bribes adds to and increases the entrenched culture around bribery. And very intuitively, bribery always benefits richer people in society for the reason that they have the means to be able to pay bribes. And that often is mutually exclusive with benefits for people insofar as, maybe you're bribing someone to, pollute a certain area that a poor person happens to live in. So as a poor person, it is not in our best interests to accept these bribes. Why then, lastly, is this immoral? For very obvious reasons, poor people should care about morality. They live in the same society as everyone else. We think there's a social contract that broadly exists here. We think they also have an obligation to other poor people insofar as you can't necessarily make a decision about what might benefit you at the expense of another poor person. And you're also a beneficiary of morality insofar as, things that are generally, seen as selfless and benefiting you as a more displaced member of society, buy into concepts of morality here. So poor people should care about morality. Why does this lead to bad outcomes on net? Well, for the very obvious reason that bribery subverts democratic outcomes, even if it, regardless of which political party would have ended up in office at the end of the day, the reality is it is moral for people's votes to be reflected in the government that they see, and bribery directly displaces that. It also, as I suggested earlier, privileges the most privileged in society. So at the end of this debate, it should be clear to you that looking outward about, what overall, with all the facts at our disposal, actually benefits poor people, bribery does not benefit them. Thank you.
Capability of these people to otherwise access benefits in terms of their political outcomes and in terms of individual outcomes. Because it is extraordinarily hard for an individual Indonesian poor person in this context to actually generate the types of political change necessary to improve their condition. This, on the other hand, is a very easy mechanism for them to inject money into their own lives, which benefits both themselves and the community around them. 4 things in this speech. Firstly, what do we support? Secondly, and responses to their setup. Secondly, on the response to the idea that it would be immoral. Thirdly, the direct benefits of monetary injection. And fourthly, on political change. Firstly, in terms of setup, in terms of what we support, we would obviously support you accepting the money, but to contest some of the setup that they provide, we think this still gives people in general the ability to choose who they vote for and not. We agree that many people would be, at least some people would be swayed by the fact that they've been paid this money, but as we understand the status quo, which we would support, we think there are large portions of the population who accept these bribes, but importantly, there are a large portion of people within that do not necessarily vote for the person who has paid them that bribe. That might be because they've accepted bribes from multiple people, but it might also just be because they are able to make that choice once they get there. There are mechanisms of enforceability that you could walk people to the ballot box, etc. Maybe give you some greater level of influence, but it does not mean that these people cannot have any kind of autonomy at all. And the only real logical reason as to why this would be true that it could be enforceable, other than asserting that you could walk with them, which doesn't mean that you get to stand with them as they fill out that form, is the idea that these governments wouldn't be stupid enough to waste their money unless they were getting outcomes as a result. But it is very, very possible to consider the fact that given under their characterisation it isn't a huge amount of money, that the idea that they could sway a small portion of the people that they pay is still a calculus which they would make, because they wouldn't have to spend a vast amount of money otherwise trying to sway those voters in the first place. So what that means is it's very logical for these parties to throw a small amount of money at a lot of people in the hope that some of those people will change their vote. So we think it still gives the potential for people in many cases to vote for who they would want to. Secondly then, in response to their material about why it is moral, first push here is to suggest that these people have is why they should care about it being moral or not. And their analysis here relies on this idea that these people are in some sort of social contract and therefore they would care about what is moral and not. The problem is these poor Indonesian people have been failed by this social contract in the past. It is unclear why they have any obligation or desire to meet it in future. But four further responses to this idea of immorality are as follows. Firstly, we think democracy is broken already to some extent within this country, to the extent that elections have been rigged, and to the extent that they want to apply this to people around the world. We think in many cases where bribery exists, that is indicative of corrupt elections and indicative of corrupt governments. The second thing we would say here is that the ubiquity of it and the fact that almost everybody does it, and yes, under their model, they would want less people to do it, but the fact that lots of people are doing it under our side of the house means that it isn't immoral for any one person within that to choose to do it. And importantly, the way we would look at that would be to say that would be the social, like the society effectively saying that this is something that is acceptable to them. The third thing we'd say is that, like to the extent, is about enforceability. So importantly here, because it is not entirely enforceable, that does not make it an immoral decision, because you still have the autonomy to exercise your vote how you would like to. All you are doing then is just taking money from people who are better off from you, and then still having the ability to exercise your right in the way that you want to. Maybe you would want to vote for that person as a result of them giving you money. That is fine, but at the end of the day, this is just very similar to tax in the sense that you take money from those people and use it for yourself. But the fourth response we'd have here then is to say this isn't necessarily different to political promises, except in a very positive way. And that is to say political promises are speculative. People say, vote for me, and if I get in, I will do something for you, which is totally unenforceable. At least this way around, the trade-off is made in a positive and certain sense, so that people can see the direct benefit of the decision that they are making. That is why this is not an immoral decision for these actors to make. Third thing in this speech, what is the direct benefit of monetary injection? We think this comes in a number of ways. The first of those is individually using the money for yourself. And their claim very quickly here is that it's not big enough to make a significant difference to your life, but we think even small amounts of money in these circumstances are extremely beneficial to individuals. That looks like things like a cash injection for the quality of your life, so that you can buy a heater, so that you can buy a water purifier, so that you can buy a pair of shoes for your child to then walk to school, or that you buy a mosquito net for your family. These things are not necessarily expensive, but they also don't necessarily come within the daily budget which these people are able to afford because of the low wages that they receive, or because in many cases these people may not have employment at all. At that point in time, given that your salary either doesn't exist or is being used on other things in many cases, we think this injection of cash is particularly useful for these people and is something which would benefit their lives. Secondly, in terms of the economy more broadly, we think having this money in these communities and flowing around these communities is particularly important. This is both in the way that it just helps people and business owners within these communities to have more money and to be able to supply those communities with resources. But secondly, I think in many cases these people pool the money together in order to make purchases which benefit their community as a whole. That is to say that you can come together with other people who have received bribes and directly make autonomous decisions as to how you would like to spend that money, which is always going to be better than the best case scenario of the government using it, which is my third line of analysis within this. So, what are the reasons that we think that it is better that these communities have this money as individuals and communities rather than the government using on it? Because I think the best case scenario for the Affirmative team is instead of giving this money to these individuals before the election, is that they get to the point of having won the election and then they spend a similar or same amount of money on these individuals. That's the most generous characterization of what these governments look like for this team. Why is that still not as good as our side? Firstly, we think it's less money going towards these communities, and the reason for that is that there are lots of unsuccessful political parties who would make these payments in advance. So only one party will actually be successful and then spend that money on that community, but in advance of the election, multiple parties and individuals would give people this money. So there's more money on our side. Secondly, it's not tied to specific things. That means you can use the money in a way which is most meaningful to you as an individual, rather than the government telling you how that is going to be spent. And that affordance of autonomy to people is extraordinarily important in these circumstances. But thirdly and importantly, as I flagged throughout this speech, it directly and certainly benefits these people in the way that speculative political promises of donations down the line, or grants or government spending down the line, does not. That is why this injection of money is particularly beneficial. Last question in this speech about political change. This is where I respond to their material about the idea that it's harmful in the long term, upon which I think a lot of their analysis lies. The first thing they say here is that you're more likely, so they try and make the characterization that it's more likely for these parties to be right-wing because they're the ones who are more likely to be using the bribes in the first place. The first claim they make here is that progressive parties don't need to. I think for many of these progressive parties, it is a way of getting yourself into the conversation in the first place. It is a way of people making themselves then aware of the fact that you exist and aware that you can act on their behalf. The second thing they say then is this is about rich individuals because they can afford to. I think to the extent that, like, yes, there are progressive parties, maybe they have comparatively less money, but they're likely to at least have some ability to fund and pay these people, particularly if they're small amounts of money, as the Affirmative team wants to characterise. And the third thing they tell you about is incumbency advantages. Those incumbency advantages are, firstly, why the progressive smaller parties need to use the bribes to get attention, as I flagged before, but secondly, what affords these parties the ability to do things such as rig elections. Like to some extent, and most corrupt elections are a reason we should allow this. That is why if you don't accept the bribe as well, then in many cases you won't ever see like the promises coming through, and that is something which is particularly important here. But also then to talk about that exposure, I think it's also useful for new candidates who just need, like, because it's proportional representation, need a certain number of people to vote for them, otherwise would not get that exposure to the public and would not get those votes. But this lets legitimate candidates get in and then make good decisions for these people. I think that politicians have largely let these people down. It is totally moral and better for these people if they choose to take money as a result of that. Very proud to oppose.
To just get up and say, well, democracy is broken in Indonesia, so let's just cop it and move on. That will never change as long as these bribes are accepted. There needs to be something that changes it. We would prefer that no one accept those bribes and that immediately has a change of that culture, more so than anything else could, to start to get it back on track. Because that decimation of democracy has still led, even in the best case scenario of Joko Widodo getting in power, still that involving also having to then take on an extremist running mate as his vice president that has given more power to Islamic parties to try and counteract the bribes that are coming from Subianto's party as well, to make sure that he still had the numbers to keep on to his majority in this debate. It has broken all politics. If they did not have to contend with parties that were engaging in that bribery, they could actually have a legitimate discussion that helped these poor people. We want to fix that. First of all, some things on setup and characterization about this, like, do we have to vote with it? Like, some are swayed, not all are swayed. Yes, not everyone is swayed, but as Jess said, there still has to be enough of a sway. So on net, these bribes are harmful because they are changing results of elections significantly, right? So, like, yes, we don't have to prove every single person votes with this, and we showed you reasons by the fact that these are very poorly policed, that it is easy to do those things that they just wanted to dismiss in this debate, like standing over someone while they vote in a ballot box, or ask them to hand over their ballot paper in return for the envelope full of a few rupiah, right? So those things are very easy and believable that those things would happen. And then also then this weird concession, they say, also because, like, you don't need to sway many. That was exactly our case, right? You don't need to sway many. So the existence of these bribes doesn't have to be effective en masse for all of these people, but you do need to bribe en masse because, as they say, you're not sure every single person you bribe will do it. That's why they spend a lot of money, but in very small amounts, on a lot of people, because they want to sway that 5 or 10% that will get them over the line. Yes, that means that there are people that are not swayed by this that do get the very small benefit. I'll deal with that in a second. But it still also means that this is having a very meaningful impact. Given that Joko Widodo only needs a swing of 5% against him at the next election to lose power, we think that if it does have a small impact, that is still quite meaningful in this debate, especially when those elections also happen side by side with parliamentary elections, which also therefore empowers these parties, even if they do not unseat him as president. Let's quickly deal with morality. So the first thing was, there's no moral obligation because democracy is broken. That is not a response to this. Just because something is bad does not mean you do not have any moral obligations to try and fix that thing, but also you definitely have a moral obligation to stop contributing to that and making that thing worse, which is what Jess gave you at first. The second thing is we hear it's only one person. One, that does not change the immorality. A person, just because other people act immorally, does not mean that you doing the same action is not also immoral if it increases the scale of the harm that that has. But also, the debate isn't about a single actor, this is about people writ large, and therefore morally it is better if no one is taking these bribes, and therefore all of that stuff about democracy being broken also goes out of this debate. And then we heard it is the same as the promise at an election. We think that we have drawn, just universally, a moral distinction between these sorts of things. The fact that like democracies obviously allow people to make promises to people. Most functioning democracies do not allow some sort of bribery, but also because that is because those promises are far more accountable. Yes, they may not uphold those, but there are other incentives that try and encourage people to do that. There are incentives to try and create those long-term gains for people that come through democracy rather than the short-termism of this, which actively harms the people that are meant to be being helped by democracy. If we show that in the long term, this fucks the lives of those people more, that's what makes a difference to those sorts of promises, right? So we think that that is all fine. Let's move on. Is there actually any benefit to these people, both in the short term and long term? Because we tell you that this is about 20,000 rupiah, right? This is about $2 US. So the idea of this is actually particularly meaningful to get $2 once every 5 years versus the harms that we give you in this debate is probably not a reasonable trade-off in this case. Even if we concede that they might get a mosquito net, which we don't think that they necessarily would in this case, right? We're talking about a country where 60% of people are addicted to cigarettes. I think that that is probably a more likely expenditure of this money. I know that's fine for you, Bostan, but we don't think that's better for the general well-being of most people in this country. One extra day's wage every 5 years is probably not a huge benefit to that person, so they needed to do more to show why that was a thing. The next thing was they said that people will pull it together. I mean, there are active disincentives to do that, right? If they are as desperate as that side says that they need that $2 and that makes a meaningful difference, why would you give that to diffuse the benefit that you are potentially getting and trust other people to just buy your entire city a well or something like that? So we don't think that happens. Let's trade that off against the long-term harms, because we said that this harms any sort of political change. What we get in response to this is that it's hard to generate political change in Indonesia. Yes, that is absolutely true. And that is cyclical at the moment, because as Jess tells you to no response, if I know I can win at least a swing of 4% of people in a small town with a bribe, and that costs me $2 per person, why would I then invest infrastructure in that city in the long term and give any political and meaningful change in the long term to them? Because that's how normal politicians get people to continue voting for them, right? But I don't need to, because I can just pay them off. That means I can use the money that I would have used for long-term infrastructure that benefits those people on my big mates at the top end of town. That I can do those tax cuts that Jess talked about at First Speaker. That I can do the sorts of things like work with the tobacco lobby, right? The fact that the Indonesian government, while people are starving on the streets, funded litigation for Peter Jackson against the Australian government when we tried to bring in plain packaging shows how the bribery is really fucking up this country, right? So we want to do things that change that culture. The way you do that is require people to have to actually give them infrastructure, give them development, rather than just give them $2 every 5 years or whatever. So that was the meaningful change that can never happen if it is easier to just rely on bribes. Don't die of smoke in Boston. Second thing though, we said that they are particularly going to be right-wing parties. What we heard was, well no, progressives do it too, but they'll do it to get in and get some exposure. But that exposure is crowded out by the fact that they necessarily have less money. And if they, the fact that you have to rely on bribes to get some sort of exposure rather than any sort of other campaigning in this country is what is already crowding them out and might force them to engage in bribes. The problem is, as long as bribes are pervasive and exist, those people can never get into that, because insofar as yes, it might get them some exposure, that is still outdone by the large amount of bribes others can do. They'd be better on an even playing field where they are not out-bribed by the next guy, because that exposure is meaningless if you still don't get enough votes for that to actually get you anywhere, because those people are prioritising that short-term gain over any sort of long-term progression that is likely to happen. Given we said that it does set back seats in Parliament, we have seen those progressives lose seats in the election that happened simultaneously with the presidential election in April this year, probably suggests that progressives are not benefiting from this to the same extent that the far right is in Indonesia. So we think that that was just farcical to say that that was beneficial. But the final harm that we gave you that got no response was that this also feeds into a broader bribe culture, is that as long as there is more bribes and it is just common acceptance of bribe culture in Indonesia, that disadvantages them in other respects as well. And we need to start changing the culture that bribery is okay. That is likely to happen more when politicians themselves are not complicit in that and reliant on those bribes in order to get into power. Therefore, they can afford to now crack down on other people taking bribes. Those other people are people like police, who do over-police poorer areas because rich people pay them off so they don't need to put them in jail. But a poor person can't afford to do that. So I think that this the bribe culture that exists there harms them in ways that go well and truly beyond any sort of policy and hurt them in more immediate ways than any of these small benefits you could get from the bribe that they wanted to talk out on that side proud to propose.
The team goes like this. They're like, parties currently spend so much effort trying to buy off poor people, and when we stop doing that, they're going to build bridges and hospitals in all of these poor areas. No, they fucking won't. Because what they will do instead, with all of the excess money that you guys aren't spending on the 300 million people that apparently they're buying off, is not give it to bridges and poor people. It is things exactly like they said. Corporations will have a larger influence, which is not being prevented under this policy. They will spend it on voter suppression, because apparently 100 million people are being walked to ballot boxes in Indonesia. They will spend it on lobbying governments or paying legislators directly, and all of those incentives are exactly the same. But secondly, if the margins of the elections are as small as 3 or 4%, it is not the easiest thing to be like, here are all these bridges and cities we're going to build for poorer people. It is far easier to win over middle class voters who have reasonable disagreements about where the centre of politics lies, rather than what these guys say, that they already vote for left-wing candidates anyway. They're not going to spend this on poorer people. They're probably just going to redirect it into fucking up the Indonesian political system even more. 3 questions in this speech. Firstly, is it morally permissible to buy votes in a democracy that is already corrupt? Secondly, how does this change what political parties do? And thirdly, what are the benefits to individuals? First, is it morally permissible to buy votes in a democracy that is already corrupt? We get 2 very, very basic reasons from first affirmative. The first is that a social contract exists where basically, like, really it was just like, this just sounds kind of squeamish, yeah? Like, it sounds really bad that you, like, spend money to get people's votes. The first thing is pork barreling is literally this, but actually, like, in countries like Australia, but it's probably just less effective, yeah? It's saying that we're going to give you a tax rebate, which is money after the election, maybe, yeah? Whereas on our side, we're saying we're giving you money before the election and you don't even have to vote for us, which seems like it's probably better. But secondly, it is legitimate in a response in a corrupt government, in a corrupt political system, for opposition parties to do the same as what other parties are doing if that levels the playing field. And the big assertion of their case is like, Joko Widodo never does this, then why isn't he getting ununiformed police officers to pose as people and crack down on people buying votes? The reason is probably because he got elected on the same basis and probably would like to use this again in the future. Query why it already hasn't been cracked down on, and the reason is that it is likely endemic in this society. And if that is the case, it is morally permissible for other political candidates to use that money to try and get elected in a similar way if everyone else is doing it too. Thirdly, even if that is not true, and like they say, well, 2 wrongs don't make a right, sure, but if on both sides there is a speculative level of democracy, and both sides have problems with the democratic system, the debate should clearly not turn on that wash of an issue, but should clearly turn on the political outcomes that happen for people. Secondly, Jess says these are enforceable, like parties aren't stupid. Well, firstly, about 1/3 of the Indonesian population accepts cash bribes, and you probably gotta have 100 million people walking another 100 million people to a ballot box, which suggests that these aren't enforceable. But secondly, government incentives exist to not crack down on it because they are the beneficiaries of policies like these who got them elected in the first instance. But thirdly, a diverse range of candidates try and buy votes off each other, which means that they also don't have incentives once elected to crack down on it. But also, they said they wouldn't do it because there's a huge population of Indonesia, but simultaneously also say election margins are very small and you don't need to buy off that many people. Obviously, these are not enforceable. People can take them and vote for whoever they want. So, secondly, how does this change what parties do? The worst claim from this affirmative team comes earliest in the debate, which is that only right-wing parties do this. First, the first reason they suggest is that the incumbency of a left-wing government suggests that only right-wing parties do this. First, it wasn't always a left-wing government in power, and I think it is, a reasonable assertion to make in this debate, you can not believe if you want, that a whole range of political candidates do this to try and even the playing field that exists. Secondly, if Joko Widodo felt threatened by an alternative party voter, buying votes, it would likely that he would start doing the same, if that meant that he could continue his electoral success. He's already shown a tendency to play with the rules of democracy as it exists. It's unclear why he wouldn't do this. But thirdly, the likely alternatives are things like voter suppression, which infrastructure easy to do and ensure that communities cannot access voting booths and voting ballots, which is worse than giving money. The carrot is better than the stick, yeah, in this circumstance. But fourthly, they said right-wing but also I would say, is it just that bad that right-wing parties are elected? Like, this might not be Australia, but significant religious minorities might have conservative values about their political system that should be represented in governments, and it's a bit glib and reductive to just say that, like, all poor people only vote for left-wing governments because obviously they believe in redistribution. Maybe there are a whole host of reasons that they are able to weigh up different political parties, and it is wrong to simply suggest that right-wing parties will get elected as a result of this. Secondly, what are the likely alternatives that political parties will do? They bizarrely suggest that you no longer have an incentive to help the poor under our side. Firstly, you obviously still do because, firstly, your party is still affected by lingering perceptions of what your party did once in government. So, yes, you can buy off people in the first instance, but it still matters if your party promised them bridges and did not deliver on them. But secondly, it also matters in terms of selling messages to those people and encouraging them to vote for you in the future. Because if you were promised money at one instance and a whole lot of other things and never delivered on it, you likely wouldn't accept a cash bribe in the future. But secondly, in terms of no longer having an incentive to help the poor, they need to prove on their side why they will spend that money on the poor. And we argue they will not and do worse things. They will do things like pork barrelling that won't actually end up going to poor people. So even if ours isn't a lot of money, theirs is almost no money at all. But secondly, ours goes directly into the hands of the poorest people that can use it in ways they want. These guys are like, well, they just spend it on cigarettes because they're poor and stupid. Which firstly, maybe if an addict was able to smoke cigarettes instead of, I don't know, stealing them, that was probably something that was better in this debate than forcing these people to suffer with the curse of addiction, which was a bizarre claim from Dom's speech. But also, like, smoking is fine. Anyway, the third thing that we say is that the likely alternative that actually would happen is lobbying politicians directly. And this is far, far, far worse. Because firstly, it imposes a top-down system of corruption that enforces other political parties to consistently do this in the future, to align themselves with corporations if they cannot do it with smaller individuals in the political system, which entrenches corruption in the system far more than currently already exists, because they can do things like buying off poorer people in an area. So we think that they can't just say, we're going to build all of these bridges and hospitals, if at no point do they ask themselves the question, currently, bribery and things like this are illegal, but they continue to do it, why would they not just continue to do it in a different way, especially in a potentially more effective one? And that is the reason this is harmful. Then, since we have proved that the political system will get worse for these people, because money doesn't go directly to them, because corruption gets worse, they align themselves with worse interest groups like corporations, what happens to individuals? The first thing they said is that the money going is not big and it's infrequent. Firstly, elections aren't just the general sort of election, it seems like mayoral campaigns and large amounts of independent little political organisations try and get elected, and for the reasons Andrew mentioned, because of proportional representation, you don't actually need huge amounts of the vote, so it actually happens more regularly than they suggest. But secondly, if they're spending such a small amount of money on bribes, commensurately they would spend such a small amount of money on infrastructure, such that a bridge can only be built in one area, which affects less people than affects everyone on our side. Another reason to believe that our side is better. But thirdly, they said that people are really fucking stupid in Indonesia for some reason, and will always spend it on drugs, which is literally the only response Dom gives. We would say that probably isn't that bad than turning to things like crime, but we would trust that people would put their children ahead of their addiction. We think at the end of this debate, look, it's not like hugely consequential, yeah? But we think that likely the corruption that exists on their side gets worse, people are a little bit better on our side, and that is the simple reason why the negative team will win this debate.
It's kind of funny, because you can tell the bits of the case that Imogen wrote, they're the sensible ones, and then you can tell the claimants. For example, their bizarre claim that the money that will be spent on infrastructure must be less or equal to the amount spent on bribes, because they're just both amounts of money that are spent. Ignoring the capacity problem with that one of them is drawing from a government checkbook, which is all tax revenue, and one of them is drawing from the small number of donors that are able to work in the field. Or the idea that these people are likely to spend this money in incredibly productive ways in a context in which the whole society is apparently like crime-riddled and all of democracy has failed them. Like, why would you get with 20 people and buy a communal heater that you can then hang around in, I don't know, like the town hall, and then like everybody just leaves it there? As if that is what is likely to happen. Let's be real about this. In reality, we know what happens. Like, Dom being like, they use it to buy cigarettes is because the sum tends to be between $2 and $5 American. And a poverty wage is defined as below $2 American, which means you are giving people, even when they are very poor, a fractional amount of money compared to the amount of money that they ordinarily had, which means it is not a windfall sum. It does not in any way bypass their thing. It means they have a marginally better day, which means they maybe buy some filter cigarettes instead of stealing Marlboros. That's the other thing. Will was like, oh, that's a problem. But smoking is already cool, and stealing cigarettes to smoke is even cooler. The first thing to talk about is what is the characterization of the activity we are engaging in. Now, in and of itself, I think that just sort of definitionally, the bit of the debate where they say, you can just take the money and then not vote for them, is not exactly what we're talking about in this circumstance, because you are not taking the money for a vote, you're just taking money from some guy. So realistically, I think that practice is actually one that falls outside of the debate. This debate is about like regretting and wishing that nobody took the money in exchange for a capital exchange. But let's bite on this. The opposition's first claim here, incidentally, I just kind of want to explain a thing that explains why the amount of money that is being offered is extremely low. Because we think that the proven efficacy in this debate is guaranteed by the idea that there is voter supervision in this circumstance. Because we tell you that they spend tens of millions of dollars. This is a high priority for efficacy for these donors, and it can be determinative in national elections. And the opposition's characterisation, of which democracy has been rigged in a large number of instances, highly implies that voter supervision is the necessary consequence, and it is actually what your vote is buying for you, which obviously undermines the idea that you're going to go and collect money from 20 different political parties, because the efficacy of this most likely means that you are unlikely to engage in that. Will's response to this is so ludicrous. It's a country of 100 million people. How would 100 million people follow them all into the voting booth? Obviously not. There is the ratio is one person giving out a bribe will then supervise many people in the voting booth. It's just this ludicrous claim that there's one day in which to vote and the vote takes the whole day, so you need an employee in the political party to do it. It's just so dumb. The other thing that the opposition says is the idea, the opposition's kind of, I think, an interesting thing to think about in this debate is if the opposition is right, then who is the marginal stakeholder? Because the weird thing is, it's either enforceable or it's not. And if it is enforceable, then they do what we described. If it's not enforceable, then why would you vote for them? Because the opposition, their mental characterization seems to be that the reason that these parties give these donations to people is because you get $2 and then you're like, I just love those guys, they gave me $2, that's lovely of them. And then you vote when you previously wouldn't have, or when you wouldn't have done it otherwise. It seems like the transitive property of that in terms of persuading you to vote is exceedingly weak. It's you weren't intending to vote. Now a relatively small amount of money that most people don't find persuasive is what is going to change your vote. So it seems like their characterization is one that is extremely ineffective in terms of its ability to change voters' ways. And that is why we just do not think that state of affairs is likely in the majority of circumstances. Will's got a couple of other responses, most of which orient themselves around the idea, why isn't the President's Party cracking down on this if they don't engage in this behaviour as much? As if that was even a thought. Because the opposition does it heaps, they just lost, and there was a riot outside a bunch of embassies, and there were riots on the street by his opponents, because his opponent already accused the president, seemingly wrongly, of both vote buying and other forms of corruption. That is why crackdowns are difficult, because losing right-wing, radical, extremist parties engage in this behaviour more, and then they whip up their supporters in a way that the civil infrastructure of Indonesia would not be able to withstand. Their characterization is wrong. One party does this more than the other, for the reasons that Jess gives you. The parties that are oriented against the economic interests of the Indonesian poor are the ones that have the wealth to do this. They are the ones who need to engage in this behaviour because certain paribus, they would not win elections. At the conclusion of this, it must be understood that the practice that is being described in this debate discriminates against the Indonesian poor, makes their lives meaningfully worse in the long run because the government is not able to help them, and it is quite effective. It is not a marginal thing in this debate. There are high levels of supervision, which we know empirically, which is why we are having this debate. It is not the same as a cash donation you are then able to just walk past. It is something that has implications there. The second question in this debate, and this is the practical material of the debate, is whether or not the harms are worth the benefits. Oh, one other thing, the idea that you would spend money on lobbying the government instead, which is Will's like big Hail Mary. The first response is a revealed preference by the actors in this debate. Political donors know what is able to get them the best outcome, currently pursue those outcomes. Given they are not doing that, the revealed preference of them indicates there is lower efficacy for that strategy as opposed to this one. The second reason that that would not work is because political lobbying is not particularly effective when a majority of your legislature has been elected by extremely poor people who are like consistently crying out for these sorts of things, because if they do what the lobbyists say, then they will be turfed out, so they have incentives not to do that. The third thing to say is that there is actually not a huge lobbying infrastructure in Indonesia, and like lobbying actually relies on really lubricated, effective personal relationships, which means that realistically there would be an extensive time lag in which you would be able to at least fix a lot of the issues in Indonesia before these things stop. That's why that Hail Mary doesn't work for them. Let's talk about the ethical stuff in this debate, because I think everybody kind of like broadly agrees that in the long term this is very bad for the democracy of Indonesia, but in the short term you receive a small amount of money. Their claim is that you have no obligation to think about the implications that it has for democracy, and instead have an obligation just to be self-interested. Let's talk about the worst idea, which is that this is the same as a government pork barreling you. The first thing to say is that the example about a tax rebate is wrong, because you are keeping your money and alleviating the moral ill of, tax, which is theft. The second thing to say, obviously, is that it is different, because in a government policy setting, you are engaging in a trade-off with government revenue, which is open to all and highly accountable. So when you cut taxes for someone, that means that the amount of revenue the government can spend somewhere else goes down, whereas this is not like that. It is neither really publicly visible, the degree or scale in which people engage with this, nor is the effect or the trade-off made clear to the voters in that circumstance. And the third thing to say is that there is a purpose problem there, which is that you are saying, I want to be in the government to do X thing, and it is fine if that is self-interested, whereas this is, if I, an external body that is not part of the government, does a particular thing, then that is like less morally legitimate, because it is not related to the thing you are asking them to do, which is be determinative as to the person who is going to be in the government. So that seems silly. Then the rest of their stuff is really just begging a question. People in democracies that have problems, do they have moral obligations? Like any moral obligation? Because the scale benefit in this circumstance is relatively large. And I think the answer to that question has to be yes, because all democracies at some point were partially failed. And in order to get to a point, given your moral obligation to your community and to your children to create a world that is better than the one in which you live, it seems clear to me that you should engage in a very small amount of short-term sacrifice. For a better Indonesia, you should not get an additional day's worth of cigarettes, you should just steal them.
That this affirmative team is talking about in Indonesia, it's clear how problematic their view of democracy is. Because from Third Affirmative, we hear this characterisation that the kind of bribery that's going on is that, for the vast majority of votes, you have one person stationed over all five saying, here, I'll give you some money if you vote this way and I can look at your ballot. If that is the case, the fault that democracy is not functioning is not the poor people who then take the money rather than possibly deal with violence in an alternative, possibly deal with intimidation in an alternative, possibly deal with voter identification laws that mean poor people can't vote in the alternative. It is the people in power, both currently or potentially in power, who have set up the kind of corruption that Second Affirmative bemoans, who might use more racist or more inflammatory statements in order to get support between far-right parties in the alternative, because it is true that they have a revealed preference to bribe, but that doesn't mean that their second revealed preference is to solve all of poverty, because, if it is true that Widodo minus bribery would fix the cycle of poverty in Indonesia, fuck me, yes, that is true. It is a shame there's bribery. We think, possibly, he would do what every other politician ever has done and fail to solve poverty without economic enfranchisement, without a strong democracy, without a mandate of, being able to win an election for the majority of politically empowered bridges on presumably higher taxes to build your bridges, and will probably do things that are more problematic. The first question I'm going to ask is, how does this change an election? And within that, I need to look first at whether or not this disproportionately benefits some parties. The mechanisms that we hear primarily at first and third about why, for instance, far-right parties might benefit or why the political elite might benefit is that you need to be rich and you need to be making poor people vote against their own interests. The problem is all parties in Indonesia are relatively more rich than, say, the average person or than poor people. And also, all mainstream parties are always working against the interest of poor people in a country like Indonesia. Like, maybe Widodo is like slightly more centrist or slightly more left-wing. He's not some socialist saviour who's going to solve the poverty cycle. For an average poor person, it probably might not be worth even the time investment of voting or the time investment of engaging in that political process. Any party has those structural reasons to be able to bribe. And as we pointed out, it would be in the incentive of Widodo to crack down on this bribery happening if it wasn't advantaging him. To which they say, but the right-wing party says that he's doing these bribes. Yes, exactly. If he wasn't doing these bribes, he could disprove that by cracking down on bribes. The fact he hasn't cracked down on them shows that he's benefiting from that. We think that's why in a two-way race, it's largely mute in who it benefits, because both parties still have some ability to put money towards that. And yes, and the answer to why they both do it then is that it's mutually assured destruction, because one party can't stop in the good faith of democracy, never mind all the other corruption. So that has to happen. We actually think that to the extent that this does have an impact, it has an important and good impact in, for instance, races where you're looking at more proportional forms of representation, where actually the ability to offer somebody $2 or $5 US is a meaningful way of starting a conversation, which they kind of mock, and they're like, why would you vote for someone if they give you money? Like, I don't know, maybe because they gave you money and started a conversation with you and said that they cared about your political interests, and that was a really important way to make it worth having that conversation about what's happening. We think that in the cases where it does have an impact, which we think are small, it is beneficial because it allows people to have their face known, it allows people to have their policy platform known. The second important question to ask about elections is what would the parties do instead? And I think this is where the Affirmative was at their most absurd, because while, as I said previously, they did identify that bribery was the first preference, they did not engage with what the second preference was. And perhaps the fact that the second thing that the far-right party has done once they've lost the election is cause riots, you might think maybe their second preference is to cause disorder, their second preference is to target minorities, their second preference is to run aggressive campaigns, or, I don't know, do voter intimidation with guns instead of money, which seems not preferable. The alternative of doing things like having meaningful policy for poorer people is incredibly difficult. And even if it's true that they would technically have some more money, like it's not just like a little bit more expensive to set up schools in a bunch of rural communities that currently don't have electricity. It is a lot more expensive and gets you a very small portion of votes, given you're likely to lose money from your donors. You're not guaranteed that those people would take the time to vote, and you're not guaranteed that they would even necessarily vote in their political interest if, hypothetically, you had a far-right party running an incredibly aggressive campaign against them. Catering to poor people is in the interest of literally, like, no party in the world, never mind in a country where poor people are particularly disenfranchised. We think that it would be incredibly problematic if they did this. And this also answers the push about what would harm democracy most, because in order to think that this bribery is significantly harming democracy, you need to look at the alternative, and that is where they have been woefully unresponsive. Intimidation is worse for democracy than starting up conversations based on money. Shutting out other political parties, shutting out voters is worse for democracy than having voters vote in a way that is in some way clouded. And that's also why their dismissing of our pork barrelling argument doesn't really make sense. Because obviously we're not arguing that they are literally the same. We are saying in a country where, in the instance where pork barrelling very likely would not eventuate because of, say, a lack of funds or because of issues in bureaucracy, the idea that somebody would vote largely in their self-interest is just a principle of democracy, that people are allowed to do that, and that is a meaningful manifestation of that in a country like Indonesia. The alternatives that we're talking about are significantly worse for democracy. The other thing to note here, though, is that the causation is totally wrong. Like, again, look at the kind of bribes that Second Affirmative talks about: funding litigation, rich people paying off police officers, both huge kinds of bribery that have bigger impact on democracy and have nothing to do with poor people being bribed. This culture of bribery, like, it's not like the disenfranchised poor people's fault. fault that democracy hasn't worked in Indonesia is the rich people who don't want a functioning democracy because they might be voted out of government. That is where this harm is arising from, and the fact that poor people couldn't get any benefit from this small amount of money is not something that we support. The way you actually change something on the trajectory to democracy is through things like education, it's through things like having people engage in the political process, and we've explained that these cash injections into poorer communities are actually the best way to get that going into the future. Why is that? The Affirmative team laughs at this here. They're like, poor people, they're like, they smoke, they're so selfish, like they just steal anything that their community invests in. No, they don't. If you're in an island of Indonesia and you know the reason why you cannot trade is there is no boat in your island, like, why would you steal the boat? Who will buy your boat? Why would that be beneficial to you in the long run? You would have no boat to get back to your island. You are capable of making these kind of decisions, and that is people's review of preferences. When you have charities that are increasingly doing things like microfinance, people recognise what is in their interest, and it's not always buying things like cigarettes. Sometimes it is investing in children, and those children are the kind of people who might be able to meaningfully vote in future elections or hold those political parties accountable. But even if they don't spend it in that way, if someone is so screwed over that literally the best thing they can do for their life is buy a packet of cigarettes, why the fuck do they owe an obligation to a failing democracy in order to selflessly give up that money so it can be given to a corporation that will just fuck them over in another way? They should take that money and make their life incrementally better. We absolutely oppose.
You can tell which parts of that affirmative case were written by Imogen, and that was none of them, because none of them It's just shocking. Imogen has lived through, what, like 10% of the elections that they have, and just absolutely understands this case far better. 2 questions in this speech. Firstly, how beneficial are the monetary injections to individuals? And secondly, what does political change look like for both sides? Firstly, in terms of the monetary injections to individuals, because the Affirmative team tries to rubbish this down the bench, I think we prove at least some benefit to a large majority of individuals to give context to this issue, and to the extent that we are able to do that, and I think flagging the second issue, I don't think they get the change they want, that is sufficient to win us this debate. So firstly, what we say is that you can use this money for yourself. We say this cash injection is important, to which they respond saying it's not a lot. But when you think about it in comparison to your own life, having 3 days worth of salary for no work is something which is beneficial and a significant amount of money to those particular people. So when Beach says a small amount of US dollars is not a windfall sum, it is when you consider it comparatively to what these people otherwise earn. And I tell you this in my speech when I say that you might not otherwise have a salary at all, but also it does make a big difference if you're used to living day to day and spending all the money that you have and suddenly you have an injection on top of that. But importantly, the other material that we add to this on the negative team is to say that this gives you the autonomy to do what you want, which I think overcomes the argument about the fact that you might just buy cigarettes. Because what that means, as we say down the bench, is that even if that is true, if that is the point at which you are at in your life, having the autonomy to do that instead of stealing, or having the autonomy to make that choice is something which we should value and should support people's right to do so. But importantly, we also tell you that maybe some people will make that choice, but there will be at least some people who choose to spend this money on their family. And that is something which is particularly important in terms of the resources they can provide, both to their children in terms of going to school, or in terms of their houses in general. But the second thing we tell you about why this is useful as a monetary injection is the way that this money can be pooled. And this particular argument, I think, receives insufficient response from the Affirmative team. So what we tell you first of all is it's important to have general cash flow within these communities, but secondly, you can directly pool this money together. And Beach tries to rubbish this by saying, well, what's the use of having a heater in a town hall which everyone has to go to walk to? But think about this with the other examples that we give, things such as a water purifier, things such as a boat, things which can exist in the centre of your town and be used by multiple people in a way which is beneficial to everybody there. The third thing that we say then in terms of this is you get more money as a result because lots of parties invest in the first place and it is certain as opposed to the speculative potential benefit of that party getting elected and then living up to their promise. Beach tries to rubbish this in response to Will by saying there are different bank accounts between the party and the government itself. But what you would need to believe then from the Affirmative team is that they have enough money in these government accounts, but also enough incentive to build a bridge in every single one of these communities, where otherwise people would receive a small amount of money, pull together and be able to do these things, or sufficient things to improve their lives on their own. That is why, for a majority of these individuals, and a majority of communities in Indonesia with poor people in them, this is significantly beneficial to them, which goes a long way to winning the negative team in this debate. At that point in this second issue on political change, the affirmative team has to significantly prove they have a much greater chance of creating the political change which they set out to do. But they fall at the first hurdle here, which is to ask what these parties would do otherwise. Because we tell you that the response of parties would be things such as voter oppression and forcing people to vote this way, particularly if you think that these people have the ability to have the oversight, which they characterise them as having, to no response. The response we get is to our second idea about lobbying. Bribes says lobbying won't happen because if parties wanted to do this, they would already. But in response, Imogen tells you that if the alternative such as cash buyers is banned, then they have to lobby or introduce voter ID or introduce these other reforms. Even if they weren't their first preference, they still could do something as a result. They also then contend who would pay the bribes, to which we tell you that this would likely be a mix of people because it's a way for progressives to get their name out there and to get involved in the first place. But importantly, that cash injections create political change, which is what this side bases their entire case on through things such as education, rather than the alternatives which would happen out of their side. At the conclusion of this speech, it should be clear, we directly benefit many individuals by at least giving them the choice to spend money on themselves, many of which will take that choice. We also are more likely to get political change, and we win this debate.
Two questions: which side benefits poor Indonesians more? Which side is more moral? Which side benefits Indonesians more? We said there is no real benefit. They show that some may benefit. That is potentially true. They did not compare that to the mass harm that these bribes have over the long term. So insofar as they might get some collectivization, we simply prefer governments do that with large amounts of money and have more incentives to do that. We tell you that the lack of the existence of bribes at the moment takes away an incentive to help poor people. At third neg, we get, well, if we could solve poverty on the app, then we would win. That is not the burden of the app, but if we significantly alleviate it, which we did, I think it would be fine. We told you that we would do that. And the thing is that at the moment, there is no incentive to target these poor communities with any infrastructure because you can target them with bribes, and then you can do that pork barreling to the middle class that the negative team said they would do instead. They said you wouldn't target infrastructure. We told you obviously they would, because clearly this is a big enough voter base. That is why they're being bribed at the moment. If you want to mobilise them with bribes and you can no longer mobilise them with bribes, you need to mobilise them with something else, and therefore that something else would be this sort of infrastructure. It was unclear why they're an important enough voter base to bribe, but not an important enough one to then give that election promise to, which they said is the same as the bribe anyway at other points in this debate. So that was farcical. But also what we heard was it wouldn't be useful infrastructure because, you know, like that money, we still told you, like it's the same amount of money. We told you, no, it's not the same, it's more. It's the government pool of money that they now give to those people, and that is probably better. But also that it is more efficient when the government is doing it rather than everyone collectivizing to buy a heater in a tropical country. The next thing that we told you, is that the benefit disproportionately goes to rich parties who hurt poor people. All we heard was, Widodo probably does it too. The responses we had to this were, one, yes, that is probably true, but like it benefits far right more. But also we told you, Widodo is still not the most progressive, and the more progressive parties in Widodo have been hurt even more by this policy, and therefore we say that this has pushed Widodo further to the right, which has continued to harm them. This isn't just a two-party system, so it's not Widodo versus the more right guy. We told us this also counted out other progressives in Indonesia who could be better, so he is still benefiting more than those progressive parties. We'd still like to get rid of that overall, and so we think that that is still better overall. Next we tell you that it has bride culture. Until third we get no real response to this, which is this isn't what made that bride culture of like the Peter Jackson litigation. Yes, that is true. We say that it contributes to that and makes it harder to ever stop that, because if everyone who is in politics is implicated in bribes to ever have gotten into politics, they cannot ever crack down on that, which is why someone like Joko Widodo can't currently crack down on this and break the cycle. They never gave you a way they would ever break that cycle, and we told you that necessarily empowers the rich in Indonesia. What did they say? First of all, one, it might start a conversation for some progressive people. We told you, one, that probably doesn't happen because they have far less money, but secondly, it was weird for them to say that they had time to grab a coffee by the heater, but no person power to enforce votes. Like, it seems weird that they would actually get any of the benefit they wanted. The next thing was they'd do other bad shit if they can't use this money. Ben deals with this effectively by saying, if that weren't more effective at doing this, then they would be doing it already, which means that this starts to break the cycle that is just like destroying democracy in this country, which means you get more movement forward, but also that that stuff is easier to crack down on than the pervasive nature of bribery and is less widespread, so harder to do. So again, that wins on this. We told you this still breaks the cycle more than the AFTAs, who could never improve democracy in the country if they did not get rid of bribes at some point and progress through that sort of stuff. So we won on the overall long-term benefits for poor Indonesians. Let's quickly turn to morality, because we heard it's the same as an election promise. No, as we tell you down the bench, the allocation of government resources to all is very different to rich people being able to buy power within that country and then steal it for themselves, and it is less accountable when you are doing it through bribery rather than through open and transparent government things. The next thing we hear, it is not their fault. We said they still have an obligation not to make that thing worse and entrench that for other people. Then the last thing we hear is it is permissible if everyone else is doing it. One, we tell you that is not true. Just because one person does something immoral does not make every other immoral action moral. But secondly, if that is true, this debate is about nobody doing it anymore, not an individual actor. So it is not permissible for anyone to do it under our world. It is permissible for everyone to do something that we have agreed is immoral under their world, therefore we should regret it.